Kane County, because we are so really happy to have more and more people join us from other parts of the county. So we can, I mean, obviously anyone can join Wild Ones of Greater Kane County. You don't have to be living in Kane County, but we're really reflecting that we're going to work more countywide than just Northern Kane County. So that's a pretty exciting thing. And while we're waiting too, I'm just going to say, we're always looking for more volunteers. We really would like some volunteers to help us in communications. Maya and I have been doing it, and we could use some volunteers to help us with the newsletter and getting some information out to people. So that would be great. We also need volunteers for our Start in Your Yard program, which is an initiative that's been going on just about a year now. And we're really excited about that. So that's an initiative, and we have our own website for that. It's called startinyouryard.com. And some of you may have attended some of the webinars and book talks over the past fall to now. So, and we're going to keep going on that. So let's see, we have volunteers. I would like to ask you if you have questions for Tom, put them in the Q&A, and Tom will answer those at the end. If you have comments, put them in the chat. And I'm also going to put my email address in the chat, so that if you have questions about anything about volunteering, if you have more questions about that, or if you have questions about the plant sale that Mary Alice is going to talk about, just contact me through my email and I will answer your questions. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mary Alice, who's our plant sale chairperson, also our secretary. Take it away, Mary Alice.
Good evening, everybody. There's a lot to report on the native plant sale and activities this spring. This is our 9th annual native plant sale. First, I just want to say that we had requested 140 free oak and hickory species or trees 2 weeks ago. And as of today, they've all been spoken for. 140 free oak seedlings and hickories that were taken by our members. And other people that wanted to use them in conservation restoration efforts. The first event in our plant sale trilogy in May is May 7th. Members who ordered trees and shrubs will be emailed a time to come and pick up their trees and shrubs at the Schweitzer Environmental Center, which is at Schweitzer Woods Forest Preserve in Dundee. And we will let you know the time, the exact time to come. We will organize your order and tell you exactly when you can come by for the order. And if you have a problem with the time, please let us know. We can adjust that. Next, May 14th, it's another Friday, is the pickup for our plants. We're getting 300 flats, which means 3,000 pints of various species of plants. And they were ordered by members and paid already. And the members that ordered those plants will be emailed an exact time to come and pick them up on Friday, May 14th. Now the public sale, we are having a public sale this year at Hawthorne Hill Nature Center, which by the way is the place where you pick up the plants on May 14th too. We're back at Hawthorne Hill Nature Center on May 22nd for the public sale. And it's going to, because of COVID, we need to control the flow of shoppers. So last week in the Wild Ones newsletter, we sent out a way to sign up on Eventbrite for a specific time to shop on May 22nd, Saturday, May 22nd at Hawthorne Hill Nature Center. If you did not see that newsletter or you can't find it, feel free to email Kim Haig, our president. Her email will be in the chat. So you can ask her and she'll send you that newsletter or the link to sign up on Eventbrite for a specific time to shop. And at this sale, we're going to have a whole lot of plants, and they're coming from Possibility Place and Taylor Creek Restoration Nurseries. We have plug size, pint size, quart size, and a lot of ferns and specialty plants. We have a good variety, not a big quantity of everything, but a good variety of plants. We will accept cash, checks, and credit cards for payment. We also are offering rain barrels through the Conservation Foundation. Also, that was mentioned in last week's newsletter and how to sign up for that, how to find out how to get a rain barrel. And if you don't have that newsletter or can't find it, again, just ask Kim Haig, send her an email, and she will connect you with the information regarding the rain barrels. I think that's it. So thanks.
Okay, on to Luann, and she's going to talk a little bit about upcoming programs.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we want to get to Tom, so I'm going to do this really quickly. On May 27th, we've got Allison Sacradote-Valat, and she's going to tell us all about frogs. Can't wait. April Anderson on June 24th is going to preview her book, A Field Guide to Everyday Life, Useful Ways to Reconnect with Nature and Humanity. And let's see, on Saturday, oh, and then we've got some garden tours. We've got Saturday, July 24th, we're going to see Patsy Hirsch's garden. And on Saturday, August 28th, we're going to see Angelica Busi Brinkman's garden. And on, guess what? Something new on October 26th, or sorry, October 28th, we're going to celebrate October with Ed Collins. Now I'd like to introduce one of our members, Joanne Schindler, who's going to introduce Tom.
Hi, I have the pleasure of getting to know Tom through volunteering through McHenry County. So yes, members are outside of Kane County. I'm from McHenry County, and they have a wonderful program for volunteers. And all I knew was I got to go out and be around plants, and it was this thing called Phenology. And the first year out in the woods, we were just tasked with noting everything that was there when it bloomed and when it went to seed. And my learning curve was pretty extensive there. And every year, it got a little more precise, and I knew this data was going to some person. I didn't quite get it. And until after about the third year, I realized I was gathering data for a research ecologist, Tom Simpson. And he had some pretty interesting questions that he was going to be able to answer with the phenology data. And for those of you that don't know that silly word, it just means noting what blooms when, what goes to seed when. It's, you know, it's nature's time clock, which now makes me very sensitive. If I go down the street and it's decorated with daffodils in July, I get kind of unnerved because they don't bloom in July. Tom, his full resume, you probably read before signing up for the program. He's just a Renaissance man. He's a jack of all trades and many talents. And the most recent I discovered, he's a poet. If you get a chance, please go and watch some of the Tom Talks. Google it from YouTube, Tom Talks, but MCCD from McHenry County, because there's other Tom Talks out there. And you have to catch the one on Nippersink Creek because it ends with a beautiful song sung and played by Jackie Barrow, who's also with McHenry County. But the lyrics, the poetry is written by Tom, and it's just so fitting an ending to that Tom Talk. So anyway, I just think he's a terrific person. And when Luann asked about maybe, do I have any ideas for a program? I says, yes, I do. And I present to you Tom Simpson.
Yay.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. Maybe too generous, but I'll just head right into the presentation. I'm going to share the screen now. Okay. I gotta find my way through all the windows. Here we go. There we go. How does that look? Okay, plant phenology and climate change. This was Joanne gave you a little bit of background on the project. The volunteer really began well, it really began in the 1980s with a super volunteer named Joyce Purvix, who really spearheaded the program in its first 7 or 8 years during the 1980s. And she had to stop because for health reasons, and the program stopped. And the data was sitting around on large format computer paper. Those of you who are familiar with computers in the 1980s will remember that. That's when I was in graduate school at the time. And on the real floppy disk, big 5 1/4 floppy disk, which by the time they were found in the around 2010, they had been demagnetized, and so you couldn't get the data off of them. So we had a grant to start the Phenology program up again, and had to get employees to type in all the data from the 1980s, which was a huge amount of data. And so we began the program again between 2012 and 2014. And really, Lori Ryan, our plant ecologist for the Conservation District, was running the program at that time. I had talked to Lori about doing the data analysis. And I participated in the data collection in 2014 just to get a feel for what that was about. So that's kind of how I found my way into the Phenology program, and some of the people, just a few of the people that were important to getting the program as far as it got by the time I took it over. I mean, phenology in general is just about the timing of biological phenomena. I mean, you hear about it mostly with plants, but it could be of insects, it could be birds, it could be any living thing, and how its behavior and even physiology change on a yearly basis. And what we're really interested in this project is the relationship of year-to-year changes in weather to changes in plant phenology. So the rate at which plants are developing, in particular when they come into flower and when they stop flowering. And my interest in it was because I thought, not just me, lots of ecologists think that the reality of climate change is very important to the future of conservation. I'll just leave it there for now. I think we all agree it's important to the future of conservation. I was asked last year when I was interviewing with College of Lake County about becoming adjunct there, about what I thought were the two biggest problems in ecological restoration. And I said one was, I thought the whole issue of diversity, race, and other issues in conservation in general, and the other one was climate change, because I think both of them are changing the ground under the feet of conservation and ecological restoration. And too often we relax in the sort of bubble of the people we know and the things we like to do, and we don't realize the world is changing around us. The program looks at a variety of sites, approximately equally distributed among woodlands, prairies, and wetlands. I would say I probably added more woodlands since this tally was done a few years ago. So we're probably pretty equitable between those different types. But we're really trying to use populations of naturally occurring plants in the county. In the fullest range of physiographic situations we can find them. Originally, in the 1980s, this study included nearby Lake County and a few sites in Kane and even northwestern Cook County. I mean, since from 2012 onward, it's been exclusively in McHenry County, but I'm not really averse to. I was talking to someone about a site in Kane County a couple of years ago that volunteer just couldn't quite follow through. It's a life problem. But this gives you a sort of idea of the geographic scope of the project. And it is very much a volunteer project. About 99% of the effort has been put in by volunteers over the year. It's I think just a wonderful example of what citizen science can do. I think with Joyce's work, I mean, first and foremost, her work during the 80s, and then Laurie's work in the 2012 to 14, I mean, just gave it such a solid organizational background. It was easy to come in and start working with a project when we started it up again in 2017. Originally in 2012, and Joanne probably remembers this, you were doing records of all these different stages in the development of principally wildflowers. And you can see there are 9 different stages. What I found in my analysis as I went through and roughly in 2015 and 16, when I was going through the analysis of all the phenology data, even back to the 80s, what I found was that we had a total of 2,000 species of plants that had been observed, but only 81 out of the 2,000 had observations in each of the, I think it was 11 years at that time. And so there was a problem of kind of spreading our effort out over way too many species and not getting enough data on a core species. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So what I did was to really focus in on these 2 key features, the ones you hear most about when you read research papers on phenology, when plants come into bloom and when bloom is over, and also we'll talk about later with woody plants when the buds open up in the springtime. So those 3 here, these 2 are with herbaceous flowering plants, and then with woody plants, also the opening of the, well, it's really a bud for the new shoots of the spring. The weather data, the chore there was to find a weather station that was nearby, but one that had a continuous weather record, really starting, I think, in 1982 all the way up to the present. And that's not easy to find. I mean, there are several weather stations in McHenry County, but all of them has discontinuous records. And so you'd have to switch back and forth between weather stations, which means a couple of degree difference in the weather readings. I wanted to avoid that. And so I went to the nearest station I could find. And the data I was getting was, I got it through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, but even now it is much easier to get the data than it was 4 years ago. So we chose O'Hare Airport. I know that's, probably 30 plus miles from the center of McHenry County, but it does have a continuous weather record over that time. And my only assumption is that when it got warmer at O'Hare, it was probably getting warmer in McHenry County, and likewise when it was getting cooler there, it was getting cooler in McHenry. All you need is a really good close correlation between the 2 to use the records, and so I thought that was our best plan. So phenology of what? How do you deal with all those plants that are out there? And so we had 81 species in our analysis. And you could just look at all 81 together and the average temperature for the year. But I thought in most studies that I was looking at would divide those species up. And so I started dividing species up and then looking at the correlation of their average bloom dates for the group. So here's a group of 12 species that flower very early in spring. You all probably recognize these. I was just looking at marsh marigold in a wetland and in the phenology program just a few days ago, sort of glowing. It's such a rich yellow-orange color. And of course, bloodroot. And I think that's hepatica there in the middle. So these early, spring beauty, excuse me. We're grouping plants by the time they're blooming and then taking the average for that group for any one year. So the early spring species, it's not a very elegant name. We had middle spring species blooming between May 1 and May 15. And I have included a few non-native plants in here. They seem to neither increase or decrease what ended up with the correlations between bloom dates. And my effort here is really to understand how plants are responding to climate. None of us are trying to restore populations of garlic mustard, but it's a plant, and it's a plant that's responding to changes in weather. Perhaps later on in the next few years, I'll try to separate out non-native and native plants and see if we can see any differences in their degree of response. But so far, I haven't looked at that. Late spring species, one's blooming. Late spring summer species, excuse me. So this is This is an interesting group. Now you would think, well, this is ridiculous. Anything blooming from May 15th all the way up until late September, early October for a few of those really, really late plants some years. And yet all of them are responding to a similar temperature signal. That in itself, and we'll talk more about that later, that in itself was quite interesting to me. I later found some support in the literature for this. You have plants blooming in May and blooming in September, all of which are responding to the same temperature signal from the same time. And then we had an interesting group of plants at the end of the year, and I call them positive responders. And we'll talk more about that later. If you talk about these other plants, they're negative responders because their bloom dates, when the temperature gets higher, their bloom dates get earlier or lower in number. And so they respond, bloom temperatures go up, bloom dates go down, or they go earlier. Whereas a positive responder are doing exactly the opposite. And so we'll talk more about those here in a few minutes. What aspect of weather and are we dealing with here? And with temperature, there are two temperature variables researchers have looked at. One is average temperatures over some time interval, and the other is degree days. And because I think probably many of you are not familiar with what degree days mean, let's look at that. If we were doing degree days calculation, you establish a base number. And here we'll say our base number is freezing. Researchers that are looking at the timing of insect emergence, like integrated pest management, find degree day calculations can very accurately predict the emergence of insects. They're often using a base of around 50 degrees. So let's look at this is just hypothetical. On day one in the springtime, the average temperature is 30. It's below 32 degrees, so we don't add anything to the degree days. On day two, it goes up to 33. It is now 1 degree above the base temperature. We add 1. Now we're at 1 degree day on day 2. On day 3, we're 6 degrees above the base. We add 6. We're now at 7 degree days. And you'll see how that degree day increases gradually through the springtime as we get more and more temperatures above the base. Again, this variable proved very useful in predicting insect emergence for people working in integrated pest management. But it didn't work as well in the phenology as when I started doing my analysis. And I admit, I thought I was very clever in looking at degree days and spent weeks looking at every possible angle, and I just couldn't make it work. And when I went back and looked at average temperatures, I found that it worked much better. And we have several researchers here that are looking at temperature averages and finding that works better than degree days. When I was doing this project, this is the first time I worked with a phenology project. So I tried to obviously use what I thought was sort of research common sense. But I also then looked in the literature. When I found something, I started looking to see if anyone else had found it. When you find things that no one else has ever found, it could be the first time that anyone has found it. More likely, it's probably mistakes. You need to go back and double check. So I'm always looking for support in the literature for the things I was finding. Here, there's some support really for looking at average temperatures instead of degree days. And rainfall is one of the things that's a little bit different than most of the phenology papers that I read. We'll see some support for this later, but just in 2019 was the first year I successfully used a rainfall variable. We'll talk more about that later. So that was, well, for a researcher, that was pretty exciting to see that. So here is how I'm going to show you these results. And for those of you who are not like me and don't enjoy statistics, this looks like a lot of lines and dots. So I'll try to take this through one step at a time. Here's a graph. This graph has dates of flowering on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is the average temperature, in this case, in March. And we're looking at those 12 early spring species. So this dot right here, well, let me pick this dot because I know which year it is. This is 2012, by far the hottest year. All of you are old enough to remember 2012. We had temperatures in the 80s in March. I mean, it's a super hot March. So this is 2012. So we had an average temperature, it looks like about maybe 53 degrees in March. And the bloom date was, I think it ended up being in March 29. So that dot is a dot for 2012, the average bloom date and the average temperature for 2012. Each one of these dots is a different year. And so we're seeing how the relationship of bloom date and year, then we see a pattern over the years. And here is that trend. When you see a downward sloping line, that's a negative trend. I said these are negative responders. So the warmer it gets, the earlier or the lower on the vertical axis, and we see that downward sloping line. These numbers over here, all of you probably went through enough mathematics to see an algebra equation graphed. That's all this is. A regression line is an algebra equation. But to try to put this in common sense, what this number here is called the coefficient means is that for every degree increase in temperature, the flowers came into bloom approximately 1.6 days earlier. All right, so that's actually pretty useful information. So for every degree increase in temperature, on average, these spring species were coming into bloom 1.6 days earlier. And this number down here has a fancy name, I think. Yeah, it's called, this one is called the coefficient of determination. And what this means is that 0.7392 means that about 74% of the variation in bloom date is accounted for by temperature. The way a statistician talks, ideally, if all these black dots fell exactly on that line, it would be 100%. But in doing ecological work, that's never the case. This is a pretty convincing equation that says there's a really strong relationship between average temperature and bloom date. Not surprising, but interesting to see it here. The next thing I like, here's 2020. Notice that's way off the line. So I looked at that and I wondered, what's going on there? And this was, all of you remember 2020. That was a pretty special year for all of us. And we had locked the phenologists out of all of our phenology volunteers. They couldn't go to their sites early in the spring because we were still at full lockdown. And I suspect what happened is that some of our observations were taken late, which pushed this bloom date late. I haven't taken that number out of the analysis now because I think it's an object lesson in how you do research and problems that can occur. That was a problem. None of us can anticipate a pandemic, a lockdown. No one can get out in the field. And when they went out in the field there, I think they were probably reporting some bloom dates where things had bloomed considerably earlier than they were first observing it. But, that's the way it goes when you're doing research in the real world. I mean, one of the things I would say, and this is really a compliment to the volunteers, not really to myself. When I started doing this project, I was thinking all the things that could go wrong with a project like this. Maybe the volunteers don't identify the plants correctly, or maybe they just make a mistake in calling a start bloom when they should have waited to the next time, or should have done it 2 weeks before. There's all sorts of reasons why something could have gone wrong. And yet when I went through the analysis, the relationships look so strong. It's obvious that the volunteers have done a really good job at their work. And so that was heartening. I like to remind them of that each time I do this project and present it to them, because this is just me doing analysis of their work. It's nothing more than that. So here are the mid-spring species. Again, a pretty convincing what's called the coefficient of determination. We're accounting for about 73% of the variation. In this case, every degree increase in temperature, the plants are flowering 1.9 degrees earlier. So a little bit quantitatively, a little bit higher relationship. So they're responding more strongly, moving ahead almost 2 days for every degree increase in temperature. But notice here, it's the 2019 point that's standing well off the line. And so again, you always look at these outliers and ask, well, why? Is there anything I can learn from that? Did we just get some things wrong that year? Well, maybe you remember spring of 2019, and maybe you don't. It was a really, really wet spring. And so I looked at the rainfall, and this is probably even more obscure to you. It's in just one equation. But what I'm doing here is I'm looking at two variables at once. Here is the start bloom date on this side. Here's my average temperature, what we've been using before to predict start bloom. But here I added a rainfall variable. And that rainfall is the rainfall in the last 7 days in April and the first 10 days in May, just the total rainfall. There's a modest increase in our coefficient of determination, but more than that, the interesting thing is rainfall made what statistically is called a significant contribution. This was important to the equation. And so that was important to me because it showed that rainfall is involved in this in a way, systematically, and when plants are blooming. This is the first indication of that. Now we're moving to those 54 summer species, and you can see again a pretty good, we're accounting for about 74% of the variation in bloom dates with average temperature. Again, 2019 is standing up off the line, but first, look here, now even larger quantitatively response. So every degree increase in temperature now 2.7 degree earlier date of blooming. Now this is, we have 54 species, again, blooming all summer, responding to these spring temperatures. That was one of, in that first analysis in 2015 and 16, when I was looking at it, that was borderline shocking to me that plants blooming as late as September were responding to temperatures very early in their development, long before the flower was present. So here, 2019, I went back again and looked at rainfall, and this time had a very large increase in that coefficient of determination. All this means is that the regression equation is an even better predictor of bloom dates. Rainfall here is even more important. So that again, very exciting for me as a researcher to see these things, to see this variable. It kind of makes common sense that rainfall would affect bloom dates, but you don't see that accounted for in most of the papers on phenology. So this is interesting, and I'll come back to this later, but if rainfall is affecting bloom dates, now look at, I forgot to say here is temperature as a negative sign here, meaning what the temperature is higher, the bloom date is earlier. But look at rainfall. When rainfall is higher, the bloom date is later. So rainfall is delaying the bloom date, whereas higher temperatures move the bloom date forward. So they act against one another. So this is important when we think about climate change, because if rainfall increases with temperature, then the two factors will tend to mitigate one another. If it gets drier as it gets warmer, then the two factors will reinforce one another and have an even larger effect on the plant. So the significance of rainfall here is an important one as we look to the future. Now here is those positive responder species, and here's a simple graph where I look simply at temperatures, and here are the temperatures in July and bloom dates. Again, each one of these dots is a different year, and the average across these 5 species, the relationship doesn't look nearly as tight, does it? The points are pretty widely scattered. Our coefficient of determination, the sort of the quality of the regression equation, is much less. We're only accounting for about 44% of the variation. So in this case, but look at this, when the temperature gets higher, rather than the bloom date getting earlier, here the bloom date is getting later. So it's a positive relationship now. When the temperatures late in the summer get higher, it blooms later, not earlier, but later. So the next step was I went back and looked at 2 variables at once. I looked at spring temperature and the July temperature and found an interesting fact. The July temperature, as I just said, has a positive sign, meaning higher July temperatures, later blooming, but the spring temperature has a negative sign. Higher spring temperatures, earlier blooming. Again, these 2 variables work against one another. This is fascinating. It's fascinating that in this case, all 5 of them native plants. There are probably other ones out there. I haven't been able to find them in the analysis yet. Fascinating that our native plants are responding to temperatures, and in a few cases at least, responding to 2 different temperature signals in opposite directions. And I want to look and ask, well, why would plants blooming late in the year bloom later if it's warmer? And if you look at this graph, you can see why. Now, this is actual data from the first, like 11 years of our phenology program. And the blue line is just a running average of plants blooming, 10-day running average of plants coming into bloom. And the orange line is an average temperature over the last 10 days. So a running average over the last 10 days. I mean, the temperature line, if we could put 100 years in there, would just be a smooth curve that peaks somewhere in early July and then went back down again, because this is 11 years. It has a few lumps in it. The bloom dates, this was, when I first did this, I thought, oh my goodness, look at this. And this is what intuitively, I think a lot of us think a lot of plants are coming into bloom early, and then there's like a sag where we don't see many plants coming to bloom. There's another peak here in June, and then it falls off again, sort of plateauing out. I mean, we have our, grassland prairie species coming into bloom, and then finally here in September, those numbers decreasing rather sharply. But notice that our positive responder species, those that responded positively to July temperatures, are blooming out here. They're blooming when actually blooming later is blooming at a cooler time of year. For almost all of these plants, blooming earlier means blooming at a cooler time of year. But for plants that are blooming really late in the year, blooming later means they're blooming in a cooler time of the year. So that's probably one of the reasons why some of these species are delaying their bloom dates with higher temperatures, is to bloom at a cooler temperature. At least that's kind of a working hypothesis. Let's look at a little bit of what people have found in the record here. This is in England, but talking about summer species blooming well into the summer there, are responding to temperatures up to 4 months previous, which is exactly what I was finding with those late spring summer species. They're responding to temperatures in the springtime, even if they were blooming late in the summer. And here here's a bit of support for delayed reproduction in species that started flowering after peak temperatures, which is exactly what we found with those positive responder species, that they delayed with higher July temperatures. Here's a bit on the rainfall, and this is, again, I always look for support in the literature. Here's some support. It's not exactly what I found, but 32 degrees of drought. Here's a study in European grasslands. 32 degrees of drought, significantly advanced mid-flowering date, sort of the opposite of what I was talking about, but not the opposite, but looking at it from the other way around. Here, a drought leads to earlier flowering as opposed to rainfall leading to later flowering. Here they found heavy rainfall didn't move the bloom date, though drought did or not. So drought obviously means that moderate rainfall was retarding the bloom date. Heavy rainfall didn't seem to have much of a change there. So at least some support for what I was finding with the rainfall. So how does this is analysis I've done only in the last couple of years, because we got very little, our 80 study and even much of the 2012 to 14 study, we weren't really focusing on woody species. We're doing some of it, but not as much data on the woody species. I've been trying to hit that pretty hard the last few years, because that's another thing you find in the literature, is talking about trees and when they leaf, particularly when they leaf out in the springtime. And here you can see a pretty tight relationship, 92% of the variation accounted for. Only 5 years. It will take a number more years before we can be very confident in these results, but it's certainly hopeful that we're seeing a very strong correlation between woody species are opening those buds and leafing out, and spring temperatures. Length of bloom is something that this is one, sometimes you see what you expect to see, and sometimes you see all your old intuitions reinforced, and sometimes you look at you find something and you see your old intuitions maybe weren't right, or at least you can't support them. Here we're looking at how warming the average temperatures were affecting the duration of blooming. So how long were the plants in bloom? So I just, and this was an initial analysis I did in 2014, but this is interesting. I'll show you a later analysis in just a minute. So I'm just looking at a few years in the 80s and the 2000s. 2012 was a really hot year. And you can see that its average temperatures were almost 5.5 degrees higher than any of these other years. The bloom dates were well advanced because of that higher temperature. When we look at the number of days in flower, even though they were blooming much earlier, here the spring species actually seem to be blooming longer than some of the other years. Now, as anyone who's done the phenology program knows, it's fairly straightforward to say when they come into bloom. When they go out of bloom is a more gradual process and hard to put a date on. And so I'm less confident in these numbers than I am in the start bloom dates. But you would think if there was a really strong relationship, if in 2012 things had really bloomed a lot shorter than other years, we would have picked that up. And instead, we didn't get any support for that. In fact, maybe the opposite. Likewise, things blooming later in the summer, really no tendency to be to bloom for a lesser amount of time. I don't. I'll just continue to follow this as we go from year to year. Eventually, as we build up more data, we'll have more confidence in this conclusion. But it certainly doesn't support what I'd always thought, and almost everyone I talked to thought that in warmer years they bloom for less period of time. If we look now, I don't want to just keep showing you graph after graph after graph, but this is looking at 9 mid-spring blooming species. One of the limitations on looking at length of bloom in this analysis is that a lot of the years in the 80s really didn't have much of any data on when things went out of bloom. So I have fewer years to work with fewer years to work with. It's hard to see relationships. Again, you see a pretty wide point scatter here between the length of blooming, so the length of the blooming period in days over here, and the temperature, the average temperature was really average, whether it was a warm year or a cool year. Not a very convincing relationship. It looks like a pretty wide point scatter. And I've looked at other groups of species blooming at other times in year and found similar, just sort of wide point scatters, really nothing very convincing. If there is a systematic relationship between the amount of time things are in bloom and the temperature, we haven't been able to see it yet. Maybe it will require other more experimental methods than the observational method we're using. Oh, this is interesting because it's looking at those same 5 years. Again, March or growing season temperature is much higher in 2012. But I looked across 40 different species and looked at the average temperatures of the time they were in bloom. And interestingly, plants seem to move their blooming periods earlier and later. It almost looks as if the average temperatures stay about the same, even though when they come into bloom and out of bloom, even though this year they bloom much earlier, they bloomed at about the same average temperature. That's a curious, again, that will require more statistical support with more years of work. But maybe it makes kind of intuitive sense that the plants are adjusting their bloom date to bloom at a similar temperature each year, and at least a little bit of support for that idea. So a few summary points now. In warm years, most plants bloom earlier than in cool years. The shift their bloom dates correlates most strongly with average temperatures in the spring, regardless if species are flowering in May or September. Exceptions to this trend are a handful of summer species that bloom later in response to high summer temperatures. And 10 mid-spring species and 54 summer species bloom later in wet years. And I can find really no support at this time. I'm willing to be convinced, but I don't find any support at this time for the generalization that blooming period of plants is shorter in warmer temperatures. This is actually, again, very important to climate change, or how we think about climate change and the threat to our native plants. Because if it warms up and plants are in bloom for a shorter period of time, they have a shorter period of potential for pollination, and therefore perhaps a shorter period for seed set and lesser seed production. So all these things may be important as we look more and more at how native plants are responding to climates and how they may respond to a warming climate over the next 70 or 80 years. Well, I asked this question, and sometimes it makes people angry to ask the question, but I think I need to ask the question because I think this is actually a very important question in the research literature today, whether or not we want to think about it here in the Chicago area. It is a very important question in the research literature today, the whole talk of assisted migration of plants, the questioning whether a focus on historical plant communities is one that we can carry into the future. All these things are very important questions in research today. So projected warming by 2010, I wanted to show these just to give you a sense of average temperatures here from Stevens Point. You know, Chicago sits right in here. It's probably around 49 degrees. So we're going up to Stevens Point, we're getting about 5 degrees cooler. And as we go down to central Illinois, we're getting about 5 degrees warmer. And when you look at projected warming by 2100, the median estimates, now there are some extreme estimates, and we don't know what's going to happen. We do not know what's going to happen. Some of the extreme estimates are much higher than 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The median estimates by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administrations put it somewhere around 3.5 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's important. That will be hugely important to ecosystems along ocean coastlines. It will be hugely important because that temperature increase will be higher in the Arctic and subarctic. It will be hugely important there to ecosystems. But my question is more limited. What does it mean here? What does it mean to the native plants of the Chicago area? It's getting warmer here in Illinois. This is just to look at the last 100 and some years, 110, 20 years, I think it is. And you can see a general upward trend of temperatures, average temperatures here in Illinois. Likewise, if you look at northern Illinois, you can see just a very slight, that line is rising. The temperature is getting just slightly warmer over the last 100 years. I mean, these, and that rate of increase, according to climate scientists, is increasing. At least right now, it's increasing. So this is, climate change is real. Climate change is real. Global warming is real. Its effect will be real. The question is, what will its effect be here, and how should we be planning for that, and how should we respond to it? So what are factors that may mitigate, in the Chicago area, may mitigate the effect of warming temperatures? Well, one of them is that we've seen it with that plants don't just, bloodroot doesn't just bloom on the same date every year. It changes its bloom date depending on whether it's a warmer or a cooler spring. So it's adjusting its bloom date to account for changes in weather. So plants dynamically adjust their blooming dates in response to weather. Increases in rainfall may partially mitigate the effects of increases in temperature. We don't know that will be the case, but it certainly could be. In general, as the earth gets warmer, rainfall will increase. Now, that doesn't mean it will increase locally, but in general, as you warm the earth, more water evaporates into the atmosphere and more of it falls out of the atmosphere. A shift in the base of normal temperatures over decades will select for warm adapted genes already present in the population. Obviously, our plants, I mean, it's a Darwinian population, so there's tremendous variety of within any populations of our native plants. And so we would expect that warming temperatures to the extent they start impinging on the blooming of some of these plants will cause a shift in the genetics to plants that are blooming earlier. And the next one, which we'll look at a little more closely, is microclimate. Microclimate variations in a landscape may help to buffer a significant percentage of climate change. And this is something that people who are writing papers about climate change often don't look at, but a few people have looked at it. A study done, I believe, the study by Jackson was done in shades in Turkey Run State Parks in Indiana, looking at those really steep gorges, if you've been there, where you have a north and a south facing slope, and looking at sometimes 6 days difference in blooming on those two slopes. So those are microclimates that are causing a significant difference in bloom dates. And the lower, the Sears and Evan paper, we suggest that when coupled with thermoregulatory behavior, which academics love multisyllabic words, that just means plants responding to changes in temperature, variation in topographic features can mask the acute effect of climate change in many cases. So there's some support in the literature. Now let's look at a study I did a few years back. I think it was 2018. Oh no, this says 2019. So I think I did a few sites in 2019. This was the big study in 2019. And these are average temperatures in the month of March, which, remember, were the predictor for those early spring species. And we've got 4.4 degrees Fahrenheit of variation. These are all just sites within Glacial Park, not going all across the county, just within one 3,000 acre area. We're getting 4.4 degrees of variation as we go. This average temperatures in March in 2018, and we're seeing 6.6 degrees of variation. So, I mean, this is coincidental, but it's about the same as the predicted or median change in global temperatures for the rest of this century. My point here is that there's a lot of well, the fancy term is thermal variation. There's a lot of range of average temperatures when you look at a landscape. In fact, if you walk around with an infrared thermometer on a sunny day and start taking the temperature, you find wide variations. Everywhere you take the temperature, it's different. And those differences are important. What this means is that if plants have to migrate, they may be migrating a few hundred yards rather than a few hundred miles to cooler areas. And at least many of the species will be able to survive in the cooler microclimates. At least that's something we need to think about as we think about how will our native plants respond to climate change. Just more support here is the March 15 to April 30 temperatures, 5 degrees difference across the Glacial Park landscape. Same temperature in 2018, 5-degree difference across the Glacial Park landscape. So lots of reasons to believe that microclimate will at least be an important factor if climate change and global warming is enough that it starts to push plants out of the habitats they've been in for a very long time. Again, back to this same uncomfortable question. There are people who say, yes, the usefulness of historical ecosystem conditions as targets and references must be set against the likelihood that restoring these historical ecosystems is unlikely to be easy or even possible in the changed biophysical conditions of the future. These are major researchers published in a major journal. These are not just a few cranks. Again, major researchers, past ongoing environmental changes ensure that many historical restoration targets will be unsustainable in the coming decades. I mean, I don't agree with either. I can't say that either of these things could be true, but I think the weight of evidence is on those saying these things to prove that they're true rather than the other way around. I think the weight of evidence now says that these don't appear to be true, but nevertheless, these are important points of view out there, and not uncommon ones in the literature today. Here's another one. Ecological investments are occurring in an environment of accelerated climate change that's projected to continue into the next century. Yet they currently take little account of such change. So more or less saying that we're not aware of the change. New approaches that optimize climate resilience of these restoration efforts are thus essential. That's a bit more vague is exactly what they mean by it, but as far as I can tell, most people mean that we should be planting plants from more southern seed sources that are pre-adjusted to these warmer temperatures. So these are major researchers saying that we shouldn't be circling the wagon around native plants of our area. However, as climates are shifting, the local is best paradigm may not apply in these changing environmental factors. If these changing environmental factors are a major driver of local adaptation. So again, all of these are really pointing in the same direction. Focusing on native plants is a normative judgment, not one based on science, and it's crucial to make this distinction clear when articulating the rationale between conservation philosophies and actions. I'm not saying these things because I agree with them. I tend to be one who feels like the whole essence of conservation is protect what grows locally, and that no one has shown, yes, that we can't do that. But nevertheless, there are a lot of opinions out there that are saying something very different. And it's all a part of what's called the new ecology. Just a few slides here at the end of the presentation what I do is I try to shake people up a little bit. I think we live in a sort of bubble in the Chicago area because ecological restoration is more advanced here than anywhere else in the country. And we've become quite comfortable in that bubble. We think that everyone agrees with us, that everyone agrees that we should be, restoring and stewarding these populations of the sort of indigenous genotypes in our areas, that we should be using those in our restoration efforts. But when you step outside of the Chicago area and start looking widely in ecology, a lot of people are thinking and talking about this in very different language. It doesn't mean we should agree with it. It means we should be aware of that and be ready for that challenge. Novel ecosystems is an idea that has been a hot topic now for, I don't know, at least 10 years. More, I gave a talk on this a few years ago at the Grassland Conference. The idea of a novel ecosystem is that these novel ecosystems really come together out of a whole sort of potpourri of human and natural influences and exotic and native species. And this novel ecosystem isn't used as a synonym for waste area, but rather as something that we should be looking at as a potential in conservation, that these novel ecosystems forming around us spontaneously as exotic and native plants come together under human influence as are in fact valuable conservation systems. Now, again, at this point in time, I don't agree with that, but this is an opinion that is out there and has a lot of support in the broader ecology picture. And rewilding is another, it's such a wonderful word, rewilding. I mean, who doesn't like wildness? Ever since Thoreau talked about in wildness is a preservation of the world, we've been in love with the word. Who doesn't like wildness? Well, if you think of wildness as the opposite of humanity, then ecological restoration is sort of de-wilding. And so a hands-off approach is part of rewilding, the very opposite of what we have been preaching and doing for the last 30 plus years in the Chicago area. Ecological restoration is very much a hands-on saving and restoring and preserving remnants of historical ecosystems and trying to use those as models for restoring others. That's very much not a rewilding approach. So this new ecology is really a radical reinterpretation of our relationship to nature. There's just no question about it. It's a broad-based movement. If you start looking into it, there's lots of people, researchers, eco-modernists, which don't want to go into the definition of all these things. I will if someone wants. Eco-pragmatists, anti-restoration, rewilders. It's a whole potpourri of people. It's not like an organized movement, but they all really challenge the idea of a historical reference concept, which has really been fundamental for the last 30 plus years in the Chicago area for how we think about the whole purpose of conserving. that those historical references tell us what to do and tell us what to protect. So will plant communities we restore today be obsolete in 2100? I don't think so, but we don't know, but we could know. And I think the Phenology program is just one program. I think a lot of other people and institutions should be doing similar programs. We could be looking at insects, we could be looking at birds. The more we know, the more we can then talk reasonably about what is the effect of warming climates. It shouldn't be an argument about that's not based on evidence. Our Phenology program is collecting actual evidence about the plants that are flowering right here in the Chicago area, looking at their response to changing weather from year to year so that we can predict the response to a warming climate. That's what we need. We need more of that around the Chicago area, that we can speak knowledgeably about what we're doing and why we want to do it. I think really, as we move forward with the Phenology program, we're going to continue to try to beef up our understanding of native plants and weather variation. We're going to try to get a better understanding of that effect of length of bloom. The third one is one that I've always wanted to do, and I keep wondering how to do this. To look at the phenological variation in any one species. So let's say look at 50 bur oaks to see how they respond differently as individual trees, to see about variation within populations. There are all sorts of problems in trying to do that, and I haven't been able to fix those problems. But I still leave that on the list because that's something I would really, really like to know. It may need to be a sort of greenhouse experimental approach in the end. But anyway, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking about this because I enjoy doing it. I enjoy working with the volunteers, and I think it's the sort of project that we, as in the conservation community, should be doing more of in the Chicago area, to learn more about how our native plants and animals will respond to changing temperatures so that we can think knowledgeably about the future. Again, thank you. So I will stop the share now and go
Thank
to the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. That was so interesting. There were a lot of things that you talked about I never would have expected. So, I mean, in some ways, it was almost a little heartening, in a way that some of these things won't be obsolete, and that the excess rain could actually mitigate some of the increased temperature. Interesting. So,
Yeah.
There was one question on the Q&A, and she said, "How is rewilding different than the novel ecosystem approach?"
Well, that's a good question. I mean, they overlap one another. The one could see that a rewilder who, for instance, if you ever read the book Rambunctious Gardens by Emma Maris, she talks about someone studying. I can't remember exactly where they were doing it, but it was essentially a buckthorn thicket. I mean, what we would think of as a buckthorn thicket. It was a place where plants had spontaneously come in, and she was, and that would be an example of rewilding, because by definition, people weren't involved in managing and changing it. Rather, it happened spontaneously. Both native and non-native plants moved in and grew there, and she was touting that as sort of, well, you'll have to read the book. So that would be an example where they overlap. But rewilding is a much bigger idea. Rewilding can even cover Pleistocene rewilding, about de-extinction of mammoths and creating Pleistocene ecosystems in the north. So it's a sort of broader term, and I would just invite you to start looking. But most of those approaches overlap. Importantly for us, they overlap in that they really don't like the idea of human manipulation of nature. And what we realized in the Chicago area sometime in the 80s, maybe before that for some people, but widely as a movement really starting in the 1980s, is that a lot of our native plants were disappearing, and they were being overtaken and disappearing, and people without a lot of theoretical thinking, they just didn't want them to go. And so they began doing things to stop it. And I think ecological restoration really evolved out of, I think a lot of things come from volunteering. Frankly, I think ecological restoration really came out of volunteers trying to do something to save things. That evolved into institutionalized restoration today, with the Conservation District, Lake County Forest Preserve District, Kane County. Also, we've institutionalized that point of view, but it really started with volunteers just caring for things and reacting to the loss. And I still think that's the essence of conservation, is caring for things. And that's why I'll need to be convinced that we can't continue to care for indigenous populations of plants here in the Chicago area with the native genetics, that we can't continue to do that. I want someone to prove to me that we can't before we abandon that and start wholesale moving plants northward. I'm not against experimental versions of that to learn, but I think we need to think long and hard about what we're doing. And I think caring for things is what started ecological restoration. I still think it's at the heart and soul of conservation and restoration in the Chicago area.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's one more question. We at Wild Ones really value Doug Ptolemy a lot, and the fact that, native birds and native bugs will only go to native plants. And that's one of the things that I know I'm concerned about too, is making sure that we have enough food for our native birds and our native bugs to eat. So, and this is, I'm a person who, religiously cuts down buckthorn. So anyway, one question, she said, it's my understanding that an ecosystem will return to its natural state given time. Is this still true given the proliferation of invasives, or would natives eventually win?
Well, you just I could talk for about 3 hours on that one. I'll try to give you a short answer. The short answer to that question is no. And the answer partly has to do with the history of the Chicago region. It was for the last 12,000 or so years, it's been a cultural landscape of millions, tens of millions of people in North America. So probably who knows how many tens of thousands of people living in the Chicago area and using the landscape and burning the landscape and hunting in the landscape and planting crops in the landscape. And so what we think of the landscape we inherited as Europeans in the early 19th century was a landscape that was a cultural landscape for many thousands of years. And there's that upsets some people when I say that, but that's simply a fact of history. And it's a fact that the native plants and animals that we treasure in the Chicago area are creatures of that landscape. They persisted and flourished in that landscape for thousands of years. So when Europeans came, they changed all the rules. And so ecosystems that were stable for thousands of years began falling apart, and they're still falling apart. Remnants today are still, that are unmanaged, are still falling apart in the sense of shedding species and being invaded, because they're surrounded by a very different world. And that very different world will continue to contribute invasive plants, animals, pollution, all of those things. So what our challenge in ecological restoration is to try to understand how to reverse some of those deleterious changes of the last 100 years, and which are in fact accelerating in their importance today. They're worse today than they were 50 years ago. I mean, I remember a study by Marlon Bowles who said that at the Morton Arboretum, that the change from European settlement to, I think, their first natural areas inventory, I think it was 1969 or 70, somewhere like that, that the change between over that more than 100 years was less than the change from 1970 to the present. The acceleration of degradation of invasive plants moving into these areas. I'm preaching to people that are already in the choir for the most part, but aren't the need for vigilance, for hard work, for volunteering for forest preserve action and conservation district action is more now than ever to try to protect what we have.
Okay, now I'm depressed again. But not
Well,
really.
the,
I'm
the, po- yeah, the positive thing is that there are a lot of people like the people, almost all of them are listening to this program right now, the people I work with, and a lot of people that come to my classes that are concerned. It's yeah, I tend, if I wasn't hopeful, I wouldn't be a teacher. You couldn't be a teacher if you really thought everything was going to go bad. I really believe that people will get their head around this. They'll get their head around climate change. It doesn't mean there won't be losses. It means that we have a lot of work ahead of us.
right. We had one more question, and that is the Phenology program run by a bigger organization, or if you left, would that program end?
This is run by the Conservation District. There are other sites. There is a major phenology site. I wasn't prepared for the name now. Probably some people listening in. There is a major sort of national site where you can contribute data. And I'd certainly encourage people to do that if they would like. This program was run really. I wish I had met Joyce Purvis and I could have talked to her about why she started the program and what her motivations were. I mean, climate change isn't a new idea. People were talking about it with the first Earth Day. They called it the greenhouse effect then.
Mm-hmm.
And by the 80s, a lot of people were talking about it. I was sort of on a delayed start, but I was in my 30s then, and going back to school and then graduate school, and climate change, or it was more often called global warming, was a very hot topic at the time. So this may have been related to why Joyce Purvis was doing it. I just don't know, but it's the reason I got involved in it. And yeah, it's run by the Conservation District. I mean, we added quite a few new volunteers this year. I don't know if I can.
Right.
I might be driven crazy if we get too many more, but I'm certainly welcome more participation if people are interested.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. I guess we're at the end of the questions unless someone has one last minute one. So, well, this was incredibly informative. I thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I will retain my hopefulness. So go out there and kill corn and try
don't lose that. Don't lose that. It's all lost when you lose that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tom. It was so nice meeting you, and I thank you from all of us here. And there's a lot of things going up there. So much. And good night to everybody.
Thank
Please
you.
come to our next program. And we are now Wildlands of Greater King County. So anyway, thank you very much. Good night, everybody.